Caroline Mercer was only 19, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that made people trust her without even knowing why. She wasn't dramatic, loud, or restless. She was gentle in the way the world rarely rewards anymore. Working evenings at a corner bookstore in downtown Richmond, saving every dollar for a community college, building a life step by step with no shortcuts, no complaints. Her parents used to say she was the calm in a house that had seen too many storms. On the night of October 3rd, 1995, Richmond felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel heavier, like something important is about to happen. Only no one knows it yet. Carolyn closed up the store a little after 9 p.m., locking the front door with the same routine she had repeated for months. She waved to the restaurant owner across the street, smiled at a couple arguing over a parking ticket, and tucked her hair behind her ear as she started her short walk home. It was barely 12 minutes. 12 minutes she had walked safely 100 times. She sent her mother a quick message at 9:14 p.m. "Leaving now." Her mother replied, "Okay, sweetie, be careful." It was the last message she ever sent. Nothing about that night looked dangerous. Nothing warned her that those 12 minutes would disappear into a silence that still haunts Richmond. By 9:40 p.m., Caroline should have been walking through the front door, kicking off her shoes, dropping her bag on the same kitchen chair she always used, calling out, "Mom, I'm home." Instead, the Mercer house stayed painfully quiet. At first, her mother didn't panic. Maybe she stopped to talk to a neighbor. Maybe she missed the bus light at the crosswalk. Maybe her phone battery died. All harmless explanations until the harmless ones stopped making sense. By 10:05 p.m., her mother called her phone. No answer. 10:07. Again, no answer. 10:10. Voicemail. That was the moment her mother's stomach tightened in a way she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. She stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the street like Caroline might suddenly appear at the end of it. She didn't. Her father grabbed his keys and began retracing her route. Marshall Street, Broad Street, past the old hardware store, cutting through the familiar intersections she'd crossed 1,000 times. He expected to spot her walking with her head down, maybe lost in a song or a daydream. But every block he passed only sharpened the dread. At 10:32 p.m., he saw something lying near the storm drain at Monroe Park. Caroline's keychain, her favorite one, the one shaped like a tiny book, a gift from her little sister. He called her name into the dark until his voice cracked. Nothing answered back. Her parents didn't know it yet, but that was the exact minute their lives split into a before and an after. By 11 o'clock p.m., the Mercers were no longer searching with worry. They were searching with fear. Real fear. The kind that squeezes your chest and convinces you something is terribly wrong long before evidence proves it. Caroline never wandered, never disappeared to clear her head, never ignored calls. Her parents knew her rhythms the way only a family living under the same roof can. And this silence, didn't match any of them. Her mother began knocking on neighbors' doors, voice shaking as she asked, "Have you seen Caroline? She left work at 9. Some blinked in confusion, some looked startled, some pretended not to look frightened themselves, but no one had seen her. At 11:24, her father stopped the car on Lombardy Street, got out, and began searching the bushes with a flashlight he could barely keep steady. The beam of light jittered across concrete and grass, across abandoned wrappers and crushed leaves, across everything except the one thing he was desperate to find, Nemonda's daughter. When he returned home, his face was pale, jaw trembling. "Call it in," he told his wife. "Call it in right now." She dialed 911 with hands that barely worked. By 11:31 p.m., Richmond police logged the call. Missing juvenile, possible last seen near Monroe Park. And just like that, the night turned into a nightmare with no sense of direction and no promise of an ending. The first cruiser arrived at 11:48 p.m., lights flashing against the quiet Richmond houses like unwelcome lightning. Officers canvassed the area with calm voices that didn't match the terror swelling inside the Mercer home. Neighbors stepped outside in robes and slippers, whispering, watching, hoping or fearing they wouldn't be asked what they had seen. Just after midnight, an officer radioed in from the sidewalk near Monroe Park. His voice was steady, but something in the pause before he spoke made every listening parent cringe. We found something. Carolyn's work badge lay in the grass. The clear plastic had a long scratch across it, as if it had been dragged along the rough pavement. A few feet away, her notebook, the one she carried everywhere, filled with sketches and lists and half-finished poems, rested open in the dirt, pages bent, edges torn, like it had been dropped in a hurry or taken from her. But the detail that made her mother collapse wasn't the badge or the notebook. It was the single pearl earring found beside the curb. Carolyn never left the house without that pair. It was a birthday gift, the last thing her father had saved for before money got tight. Seeing that lonely earring on the concrete felt like seeing a cry for help frozen in time. And for the first time that night, every person on that street understood. Caroline didn't just disappear. Something or someone took her. By 1:30 a.m., the Mercer home no longer felt like a place where life happened, only where fear waited. Officers moved in and out with radios pressed to their shoulders, speaking in clipped, controlled tones meant to keep the family calm. But nothing could calm a mother who kept staring at the front door like she could will her daughter through it. Caroline's little brother sat on the stairs, gripping the wooden railing until his knuckles went white. He kept asking the same question over and over, his voice cracking each time. Why isn't she answering? She always answers. Her father stood in the living room, silent, trembling, staring into the dark street. He had always been the steady one, the one who fixed things, the one who kept the family anchored when the world became too much. But now his hands shook so violently he had to hide them in his pockets, because for the first time, he couldn't fix anything. He couldn't even breathe without feeling like the night itself was suffocating him. At 2:07 a.m., an officer stepped forward with a tone that changed everything. We're initiating a missing persons protocol. Only 6 words, but they sounded like a sentence. A declaration that the nightmare wasn't a misunderstanding, that the silence wasn't an accident, that Caroline wasn't coming through that door tonight. And that realization, that brutal, shattering truth, broke something in the room that could never fully be repaired. Flashlights cracked through the darkness as officers and frantic neighbors flooded the streets around Sycamore Lane. Every beam of light cut across bushes, fences, ditches, and driveways. Each sweep followed by a held breath, the kind that hurts the chest when hope starts slipping into fear. The Mercers weren't watching anymore. They were running. Carolyn's mother moved from yard to yard calling her daughter's name until her voice collapsed into a hoarse whisper. Her father checked every alley he could reach, kicking through leaves and trash, shouting into silence that refused to answer him back. One officer found her backpack at the corner of Orchard and Pine, the zipper torn, one strap snapped, and her notebook pages scattered across the pavement as if someone had ripped them out in a struggle. The sight punched the air out of Caroline's mother's lungs. She fell to her knees, reaching forward with shaking hands like she could touch the last moment her daughter had been conscious. The officer tried to speak, to offer reassurance, to say something that sounded like control, but the words never came. Because no matter how much training prepares you, nothing prepares you for the look in a parent's eyes when the world steals their child. The search officially expanded. The fear officially became real, and the night that began with Caroline walking home had already changed Richmond forever. By the time the clock struck 3 a.m., the entire neighborhood felt different, like the streets were holding their breath, like every shadow had suddenly learned how to watch. Police tape flickered in the cold breeze, while officers whispered updates that made the Mercer family's faces sink lower each time they overheard a fragment. People who had lived on Sycamore Lane for 30 years, people who once left their doors unlocked and slept with windows open, were now standing on porches with arms wrapped around themselves, staring down the street as though danger might still be hiding in plain sight. Caroline's grandmother arrived just before dawn, wrapped in a heavy coat over her nightgown, her eyes swollen from crying during the entire drive. She kept asking, "Where is she? Where did she go?" But no one had the strength to lie and no one had the truth to offer. Her voice cracked every time she whispered, "She's just a child. She's just a child." Officers widened the search radius. Volunteers spread out in groups of 5. Every rustle in the bushes made heads whip around. Every creak on a porch made people flinch. Richmond had faced storms, crime, and hard years before, but nothing had ever felt like this. This was different. This was a wound delivered from inside its own streets. Because when a girl disappears only minutes from her front door, a community doesn't just lose safety, it loses trust in the ground it walks on. Detective Marcus Hale arrived on Sycamore Lane before sunrise, coffee in hand, tie crooked, eyes already narrowed with the kind of tension that meant he knew this wasn't going to be a simple missing person report. He'd worked Richmond cases for years, but something about the way Caroline's mother clung to her daughter's backpack, fingers trembling, knuckles white, made him stop mid-sentence as he approached. This wasn't a runaway. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was fear carved into human form. The officers who had been first on scene briefed him quickly, backpack on the curb, shoulder strap torn, Caroline's phone found a few feet away, screen cracked, last text never answered. No signs of struggle beyond that. No blood, no footprint, no broken glass, nothing to point toward a direction or a motive. Just silence where her voice should have been. By mid-morning, neighbors filled the sidewalks with blankets wrapped around their shoulders, offering whatever they could remember. Some claimed they heard a car engine rev just after midnight. Others swore they saw a shadow near the old oak tree, but didn't think anything of it at the time. The stories collided, contradicted, and tangled until nothing felt reliable anymore. Hale pressed forward anyway. He ordered drones, K-9 units, door-to-door checks, and a full sweep of the drainage ditch behind the Mercer's backyard. No matter where they searched, the answer stayed the same. Carolyn was gone, and the ground refused to give up where she'd been taken. He looked at the backpack one last time before sending it to the lab and whispered under his breath, "We're already behind." By the afternoon of the second day, Richmond felt like a city holding its breath. Every radio station, every lunch counter, every hallway at Caroline's high school buzzed with theories. Some hopeful, some cruel, for them loud enough to drown out the truth. Detective Hale and Detective Rowan split the early leads. The first was Jordan Ellis, the quiet kid from 2 houses down, a boy Caroline had tutored in algebra the year before. He stammered through the interview, terrified and shaking, insisting he hadn't seen her in days. His mother hovered behind him, arms crossed like she was shielding him from the world. Nothing about him felt right, but nothing felt wrong either. No motive, no opportunity, no link. Next came Mr. Claremont, the aging groundskeeper who worked nights at the community college where Caroline's mother taught. Rumors had rushed through the PTA like wildfire, that he stared too long, that he lingered too often, that he roamed the neighborhood even when he wasn't working. When detectives brought him in, he simply sighed, placed his hands on the table, and said, "I heard the news. I knew you'd come." But his time card was airtight, his alibi checked out down to the minute. The most alarming lead came from a teenage witness who claimed he saw Caroline talking to someone in a silver sedan near the intersection of Grove and Patterson. But when Hale requested traffic cams, he found out what he feared. In 1990, that block didn't have a single working camera. No footage, no plate number, no confirmation. What they had now was a storm of rumors, a flooded tip line, and a growing sense that whoever took Caroline had moved fast and knew how to disappear faster. Detective Hale closed his notebook with a hard snap. "Too many shadows," he muttered. "Not enough light." The detectives weren't the only ones drowning. Inside the Walker home, grief moved like a storm that refused to pass. Carolyn's mother, Evelyn Walker, hadn't slept since the night her daughter vanished. She sat at the kitchen table every morning with the same cold cup of coffee, staring at the driveway like she expected Caroline to walk up the path any second. She replayed the last phone call, Caroline's soft, "I'll be home soon," until the words lost their shape. Her father, Michael, tried to be the strong one, but even he cracked under the weight. He drove the same 3-mile stretch over and over again, whispering her name at every stoplight. He'd pull over to check drainage ditches, abandoned sheds, even trash bins, searching places no parent should ever have to look. Each time he returned home empty-handed, he stepped inside slower, like the house itself accused him of failing his daughter. Detective Hale visited often. more often than he needed to, really. He'd sit with Evelyn in the living room as she clutched Caroline's denim jacket. She hates the cold, Evelyn said through shaking breaths. She hates it. Someone has her. Someone does. There was no comfort to give, only the unbearable truth that they still had nothing. No witness willing to step forward. No object linking her to a location. No confession whispering a direction. Just absence. A kind that hollowed out every corner of the Walker home. Behind closed doors, Evelyn sobbed into her daughter's pillow while Michael stood in the hallway, hands trembling against the wall, realizing something he couldn't yet bring himself to say out loud. He wasn't sure their family would survive this. By the end of the first week, Richmond was no longer a city. It was a pressure cooker. Every neighbor had a theory. Every stranger became a potential threat. And every rumor spread faster than the truth could catch up. Detectives Hale and Porter were buried under anonymous tips. Some were well-meaning. Most were noise. A teenager claimed he saw a white van circling Caroline's bus stop. Another caller insisted she'd been taken by a mysterious jogger who always ran the same route near the river. An elderly man swore he heard a girl screaming near a parking lot at 2 a.m., but he couldn't decide which lot it was. None of it fit. None of it helped. Then came the main suspect. Not because evidence pointed to him, but because the town needed someone to blame. Tommy Granger, a local dishwasher with a quiet personality and a reputation for keeping to himself, became the target overnight. A coworker mentioned he acted strange the night Caroline vanished. The city seized on that. People wanted certainty, not accuracy. Detectives questioned him for hours. He didn't crack because there was nothing to crack. He knew nothing. But the damage was done. His windows were shattered, his tires slashed. Rumors branded him guilty long before the truth had a chance. Journalists camped outside the Walker home, hungry for a headline instead of answers. "Is Caroline alive?" they asked, shoving microphones toward parents who could barely breathe. Every day without progress tightened the fear around the community's throat. And for detectives Hale and Porter, one thing became painfully clear. They weren't just fighting a missing persons case. They were fighting a city losing control. 2 weeks into the search, desperation finally pushed the department towards a lead they wanted to believe. Not one supported by truth. And that decision cost the case years. A woman from the far west end of Richmond claimed she saw a girl who looked just like Caroline getting into a dark sedan near a grocery store. She sounded confident. She insisted she remembered the girl's hair, height, and jacket. It was enough to trigger a full departmental shift. Detectives Hale and Porter rerouted nearly all available manpower toward tracking that sedan. Traffic cameras were pulled. DMV records poured over. The patrol cars were assigned to sweep entire blocks. For 48 straight hours, Richmond police moved like an army hunting shadows. But when Hale interviewed the witness again, the cracks showed immediately. She hesitated. She second-guessed herself. She admitted she might have mixed up the date. Maybe the girl wasn't wearing a jacket after all. Maybe it wasn't even the same night Caroline vanished. By the time the truth came out, that the girl she saw was her neighbor's niece visiting from out of town, the damage was already set in stone. 2 full days that could have been spent following real evidence. Gone. Officers exhausted. Families furious. Detectives forced to explain why they'd chased an illusion instead of the truth. Hale slammed his notebook shut so hard the table shook. Porter stared at the wall in silence. The kind of silence that comes from knowing time had slipped through their hands. And they were the ones who opened their fingers. The case didn't just stall, it buckled. As days bled into weeks, Richmond shifted from a community united in fear to a community divided by suspicion. Every porch light stayed on. Every stranger drew a second look. Parents who once chatted on sidewalks now pulled their children indoors at the sight of an unfamiliar car. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some whispered that Caroline had run away. Others claimed her parents were hiding something. A few pointed fingers at neighbors they never trusted but never had reason to question. Until now. Detective Hale watched it unfold with a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a slow, painful collapse of trust. One afternoon, while officers were canvassing a neighborhood off Chamberlain Avenue, a shouting match broke out between 2 residents. One accused the other of being too quiet, too strange. The second man fired back, saying the accuser was just trying to hide his own guilt. Police had to separate them before punches were thrown. Porter scribbled furiously in her notebook, knowing none of this chaos helped them find Carolyn. But all of it showed how deeply the case had scarred the city. People weren't helping anymore. They were defending themselves. Even the tip line turned sour. Call after call came in, not with useful leads, but with petty grudges wrapped as suspicions. That man walks his dog too late at night. That teenager wears all black. Must be involved. That couple never talks to anyone. Noise drowned out truth. And as the community pointed fingers at each other, the person responsible for Caroline's disappearance watched quietly, safely hidden behind the chaos. By the middle of August, the investigation had become a maze with no ending. Every lead contradicted another. Every alibi created a new hole. Every witness remembered the same night differently. One woman swore she saw Caroline near the old library at 10 p.m. Another insisted she spotted her on Lee Street at the same exact time. A teenager claimed he passed her near a bus stop, but the bus schedule proved he couldn't have been there. Every answer fell apart under the slightest pressure. Detective Hale pinned maps across an entire wall, color-coded timelines, circles marking locations, arrows trying to connect clues that refused to form a pattern. Detective Porter stood beside him one evening, arms crossed, eyes heavy. "We're chasing shadows," she said quietly. Hale didn't respond. He didn't have to. The truth hung between them. The media added fuel to the fire. Local papers published stories with dramatic headlines that distorted facts. Talk shows invited experts who knew nothing but speculated loudly. Citizens began forming their own theories, some accusing random people on public forums, others claiming the police were covering something up. It became harder and harder to separate truth from noise. Meanwhile, the original evidence was limited. A backpack, a torn sleeve, a shoe print that could have belonged to anyone. The forensics team sent everything to the lab, but 1990 wasn't a year known for breakthroughs. There was no advanced DNA database, no genealogy tools, no digital surveillance, just guesswork, interviews, and a city suffocating under its own fear. Hale wrote in his notes that night, "Every day that passes feels like losing her all over again." The weight of failure was closing in. Caroline's parents tried to stay strong during the first week, but by the second, the strain became unbearable. Her mother, Linda, barely slept. She sat in the living room every night with the porch light on, staring at the driveway as if willing her daughter to appear. Her trembling hands clutched Caroline's green scarf, the one she wore every autumn. Her father, James, took a different path. He searched. He walked every block from Church Hill to Shockoe Bottom, stopping strangers to ask if they had seen his daughter. He combed through parks, abandoned warehouses, and alleys police had already cleared. Hale tried to convince him to go home, to rest, but James wouldn't hear it. "Rest is for people who have answers," he said. "I don't." Neighbors brought food, prayed with them, offered to help with flyers. But kindness couldn't fill the absence. It only reminded them of it. One night, Linda broke. She stood in the precinct lobby at 3 a.m., tears running down her face, begging the desk officer to please do more. Detective Porter rushed out to meet her, guiding her into a quiet hallway, but the pain pouring out of her didn't stop. "She's my baby," Linda whispered. "Someone took her from the world, and she's out there alone. How can anyone sleep when she's alone?" Porter stayed with her until dawn. After that night, something shifted. The Parkers, once hopeful, became shells of themselves. James stopped talking. Linda stopped smiling. The warmth that once filled their home drained out of it, replaced with a silence so heavy the walls seemed to carry it. Their suffering became the heartbeat of the case, a constant reminder that time wasn't just passing. It was stealing. As the days dragged into weeks, the investigation began to buckle under forces that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with appearances. Richmond city officials were feeling the pressure. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, radio stations demanded answers, and residents whispered angrily in grocery store aisles. Fear was spreading faster than facts, and the people in charge wanted the discomfort buried quickly. Detective Hale and Officer Porter pushed for expanded searches, overtime approval, and a specialized forensic team from out of state. Each request was met with another bureaucratic wall. Budget cuts, public image concerns, reallocation of resources. The language of convenience. At one closed-door meeting, a deputy chief even suggested they start preparing a statement that the girl probably left voluntarily. Hale nearly snapped. He slammed his folder shut and said, "She didn't run. Someone made her disappear." But in a city where politics ruled the badge, conviction wasn't currency. By early November, the task force shrank from 8 officers to 2. Media coverage fizzled once a newer, louder story hit the headlines. Tips dried up, hope thinned. Then came the final blow. The order to officially classify the case as inactive. No perpetrator, no confirmed crime scene, no more hours to spare. Hale held the case file in his hands that afternoon, staring at Caroline's school photo clipped to the front. Her smile felt like a promise he hadn't kept. Porter stood beside him in silence, jaw tight, unable to process how quickly the city had chosen to forget a missing girl. The file went into a drawer. The drawer went into a cabinet. The cabinet was locked, and the world moved on, except for the people who loved her. While Richmond turned the page, the Thompsons lived in a chapter that never ended. Their living room, once warm and loud, became a command center of grief. A table covered in maps, newspaper clippings, and a phone that rarely rang but still poisoned the air with hope every time it buzzed. Caroline's mother, Denise, carried her daughter's denim jacket everywhere she went. When she spoke to detectives, to neighbors, to reporters, her voice shook, but her resolve never did. "She's out there. She needs us." People would nod politely, but the sympathy faded faster than the flyers stapled to telephone poles. Her father, Marcus, took a different path. He walked the neighborhoods alone at night, flashlight in hand, retracing every route Caroline might have taken. Rain, cold, exhaustion, none of it mattered. He searched fields, alleyways, abandoned sheds, open lots, anywhere a desperate mind could imagine a clue might be hiding. He didn't trust anyone else to look hard enough. Not anymore. Detective Hale visited the Thompson home often, even after the case was closed. He didn't come as an officer, he came as a man who couldn't let go. He listened. He took notes he wasn't allowed to file. He promised them that inactive didn't mean forgotten. But the hardest moments came late at night, when the house was silent and the truth felt louder than any sound. Caroline wasn't home. No one knew where she was, and the people with the power to find her had stopped trying. Her mother once whispered to Hale during a quiet moment, "How do you sleep when your child is missing?" He didn't answer. He couldn't, because grief like that never rests. When the investigation went quiet, the Thompson family entered a different kind of timeline, one where days moved forward, but nothing truly changed. Holidays came, but the table always felt uneven, as if one empty chair tilted the entire house off balance. Birthdays passed like shadows. And every year on April 9th, Denise baked a cake she never cut. She said it felt wrong to let the date pass without acknowledging the girl who should have been blowing out the candles. Neighbors tried to be kind in the beginning. They brought casseroles, flowers, and promises that justice would come. But people have lives, distractions, problems of their own, and slowly their footsteps stopped coming up the Thompson driveway. The casseroles stopped. The promises dried up. Eventually, people avoided eye contact in the grocery store because they didn't know what to say anymore. Caroline's younger brother, Jacob, carried his grief silently. He kept her bedroom exactly the way she left it. The desk still covered with school notes, the posters still hanging crooked on the wall. Sometimes he sat on her bed and talked into the air, asking her if she was scared that night, if she tried to call out, if she knew he would have run through fire to find her. But the room stayed still. The air stayed cold. The family fell into a rhythm built around loss. They didn't talk about moving. They didn't change their phone number. They didn't even repaint the porch, afraid that altering anything might erase the last place she stood alive. The world kept spinning. But in the Thompson home, time stayed locked in the moment Caroline vanished. Richmond moved on long before the Thompson family ever could. New buildings rose, roads widened, and the neighborhoods that once whispered Caroline's name slowly replaced memory with convenience. The corner store where she was last seen changed ownership 3 times. By 2008, the clerk who had spoken to police that night had moved out of state, and a new family ran the place, unaware that the ground beneath their shop once carried a story the city never solved. People age, priorities shift, and tragedies, no matter how heavy, eventually fade for those not living inside them. For Richmond, Caroline's disappearance slipped from breaking news to a cautionary tale, then to a rumor, and finally to something mentioned only when someone asked, "Whatever happened to that girl?" Even the police department changed. Detectives retired, transferred, or passed away. Case files were boxed, labeled, and lowered into the archives, a basement that held more heartbreak than paper. Most officers who joined in the 2010s didn't even know there was an unsolved case connected to April 9th, 1995. On Caroline Street, time rewrote history the way it always does. Families moved in who had never seen her face, never walked past the posters that once covered every telephone pole, never heard the search helicopters that circled for days. Kids played in driveways, parents mowed lawns, and the world continued its ordinary routines, unaware that the quiet they enjoyed existed because someone else's story had been buried under it. Richmond didn't forget out of cruelty. It forgot because forgetting is easy when the pain isn't yours. While the city's memory faded, Caroline's mother, Denise Thompson, lived inside a world that never moved forward. Every morning at 6 a.m., she walked to the edge of Brooklyn Park Boulevard, the last confirmed place her daughter had been seen, and placed a single daisy on the curb. Rain, frost, blistering heat. It didn't matter. She showed up because Caroline hadn't been allowed to. Denise kept her daughter's room exactly as it was in 1990. The posters on the wall stayed taped, the books on her shelf remained in the order Caroline left them, and the blue sweater that she wore the week before she vanished still hung on the back of her chair. Denise dusted it every week. She couldn't explain why, only that it felt wrong to let time erase what tragedy had already stolen. Every year on April 9th, she mailed a handwritten letter to the Richmond Police Department asking, "Is there anything new?" Most years, she didn't get a reply. On the years she did, it was a standard form letter offering sympathy, not answers. Her marriage didn't survive the weight of silence. Grief turned into distance, distance into blame, and eventually her husband packed a single suitcase and left. Denise never judged him for it. She understood that not everyone can live beside a wound that never closes. But she stayed. She stayed because someone had to. And though the town forgot, Denise made sure one thing never happened. Caroline's name never stopped being spoken inside that house. By the early 2000s, Richmond had grown louder, busier, more distracted. New families moved into Brooklyn Park. Old stores closed, new restaurants opened, and the generation that once searched for Caroline aged into adults with different worries. Time didn't erase her. It simply pushed her into the corners of conversation, the way small towns eventually turned tragedy into a kind of legend. Kids growing up in the neighborhood heard the whispers, the Thompson girl who never came home, the shadow on Brooklyn Park Boulevard, the warning parents used when they wanted kids home before dark. The story drifted into something half remembered, half feared, a cautionary tale spoken when porch lights flickered or when a stranger lingered too long near the sidewalk. But the details? Those faded. They always do. Newer residents had no idea who Caroline Thompson was. They only knew there had once been a girl who vanished on a spring night, leaving behind a backpack, a broken family, and a city that learned to be afraid of its own quiet. The news stations stopped mentioning her by 2005. Crime reporters moved on. Detectives turned their attention to fresher cases with fresher leads. Even the old missing posters, sun-bleached and peeling, were removed during a city cleanup effort in 2000, just tossed away like garbage. The disappearance of a real girl became a campfire story with no ending, told without her voice, without her truth, without anyone left to correct the details. Except her mother. One woman refused to let folklore finish what the killer started. Detective Alan Rourke stayed on the force long after most of his academy class had retired. Some thought it was loyalty. Others assumed he simply didn't know how to live without the badge. But those closest to him knew the truth. One case never left him. One girl never left him. Caroline Thompson. He carried her file the way some men carry regret. Even after the case went cold, even after the department boxed everything away, Rourke kept a single photo of Caroline tucked inside his wallet. Her school portrait, shy smile, bright eyes, hair pinned back. He looked at it every time a new missing persons report came in, silently asking himself why he couldn't save her. As the years passed, he visited the spot where her backpack was found, the corner of Brooklyn Park Boulevard near the old brick bus stop. Sometimes he'd stand there for 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, not investigating, just refusing to forget what everyone else tried to move on from. By 2012, Rourke's hands had begun to shake. His steps slowed, his voice softened. But even on his last day at the precinct, when he turned in his badge and cleared out his desk, he paused before leaving the hallway. He stared at the wall of old case photos, retired detectives, solved mysteries, smiling families reunited, and then at the empty space where Caroline's photo had once hung. "Don't let her disappear twice," he muttered to the younger officers. Most didn't understand what he meant, but he did. When he died in 2016, his daughter found something in the breast pocket of his old coat. Caroline's school portrait, laminated from years of wear. He never stopped carrying her, even when no one else did. Caroline's mother, Marlene Thompson, aged faster than time itself. Grief does that. It doesn't steal years, it steals the meaning inside them. But she refused to let her daughter become a fading headline or a town whisper people only mentioned when the weather turned gloomy. She made sure Caroline stayed present, even when the world begged her to let go. Every year on March 11th, Caroline's birthday, Marlene baked a small vanilla cake, just one layer. Icing always the same pale blue. She set a candle on top, lit it, and waited in silence at the dining table until it burned all the way down. She never cut the cake. She never ate it. At midnight, she wrapped it in foil and placed it in the freezer beside the cakes from the years before. By 2020, there were 24 of them stacked like frozen memorials, each one untouched, each one a year stolen from her daughter's life. She kept Caroline's room exactly the way it was in 1995. Posters still on the wall, homework still in the desk drawer, her favorite denim jacket still hanging on the hook behind the door. Dusk gathered, seasons changed, neighbors moved away, but Marlene couldn't make herself disturb anything. "She might walk back in," she would say softly. "I want her to find home." The town learned to give her space. Some pitied her, some avoided her, but everyone knew that when porch lights around Richmond glowed slightly brighter each March, it was because Marlene had urged people, year after year, to leave a light on for Caroline. And even when most forgot, Marlene didn't. She carried hope the way others carried breath, quietly, painfully, relentlessly. Detective Samuel O'Connor retired in 2008, but the Thompson case didn't retire with him. It followed him home, clung to the edges of his sleep, and sat at the foot of his bed on the nights he couldn't escape the sound of Marlene's voice asking the same question for years. "Did you miss something?" The truth, the one he never admitted out loud, was that he asked himself that exact question every single day. He kept Caroline's photo in his wallet, tucked behind his driver's license. Not out of duty, out of guilt. It was the face he looked at before every fishing trip, every birthday dinner with his grandkids, every holiday morning. He'd slip the picture out, stare into those bright eyes frozen in time, and whisper, "I'm sorry, kid, I should have found you." His wife once asked why he still carried the photograph. O'Connor just shook his head and said, "Because someone has to." He never threw out his old case files either. They sat in a cardboard box in the garage, worn from humidity, corners softened by years. He reread them every January, hoping fresh eyes on old words might spark something new. It never did. What broke him most wasn't the lack of answers. It was the silence. The case that once filled conference rooms with reporters now lived only in one retired man's notebook and a mother's memory. On the night before his stroke in 2016, he told his son, "If they ever reopen Caroline's case, make sure they know I didn't stop caring." The next morning he was gone, but the guilt stayed behind, sealed in that box, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. For more than 2 decades, the cardboard box labeled CT 1995, Thompson, Caroline, sat untouched on a steel shelf deep in the Richmond Police Department's basement archives. The marker ink had faded to a washed-out gray. The tape had dried and cracked like old skin. Dust gathered thick along the edges, the kind that settles only when time itself stops moving. Inside it were the last things she ever carried through life. Her denim jacket, a broken hair clip, a page from her literature notebook, and a tiny scrap of fabric found beneath her fingernail. A clue so small it had meant nothing in 1995. Back then, the lab didn't have the technology to read what it carried. By 2005, no one even remembered that fragment existed. Officers retired, others transferred. New detectives walked past the archive shelves without knowing the stories imprisoned inside the boxes. Caroline's was just one of hundreds, forgotten not because no one cared, but because no one expected time to give them another chance. Every year, the department conducted inventory, checking boxes, updating logs. Each time they reached hers, an officer would scan the label, mutter "cold case," and move on without lifting the lid. That box became a symbol of everything her mother feared. A life reduced to paperwork, stored away, never opened, never answered. But in 2020, when a statewide push for reopening unsolved cases launched, a young evidence clerk named Maya Holt pulled the box off the shelf and paused. Something about the worn tape, the faded ink, the dated handwriting made her chest tighten. She opened it, and for the first time in 25 years, Carolyn's evidence finally saw the light again. While Richmond moved on, Evelyn Thompson never did. Her life split in two the night Caroline disappeared. The years before, filled with noise and plans and laughter, and the years after, marked by silence that never softened. Every morning, Evelyn placed her daughter's photo on the kitchen counter while she made coffee, whispering the same words, "I won't let them forget you." She called the police department every birthday, every Christmas, every anniversary of the night her daughter vanished. Some officers knew her voice before she even introduced herself. Others sighed quietly, assuming she was just another grieving parent who couldn't accept the truth. But grief wasn't the force that kept her going. Refusal was. Refusal to believe her daughter's last moments had to stay buried under paperwork and unreturned calls. She organized small neighborhood walks every June. The first year, almost 50 people came. By the fifth, there were fewer than 10. By the 10th, she walked alone, carrying a candle that flickered in the humid Virginia air. The world around her changed. New roads, new neighbors, new families. But her ritual stayed the same. She kept filing petitions to reopen the case, even when they were denied. She visited the spot where Caroline's backpack had been found, leaving fresh lilies every week. Rain or shine, winter or summer, people whispered she should let go. She never listened. In her journal, she wrote just one sentence every year: "I am still here." And because she stayed, because she kept fighting when everyone else turned the page, the case she refused to bury finally began to breathe again. As the years pressed forward, Richmond's memory began to blur. New developments rose where old streets once stood, families moved in and out, and the story of Caroline Thompson faded into the background of a city that didn't want reminders of its darkest night. Cafes that once displayed her missing posters took them down when the edges curled. Teachers who once spoke her name during safety assemblies retired. The classmates who had marched through neighborhoods with flyers grew older, built new lives, and learned how to live without looking over their shoulders. But inside a dusty records room in the basement of the Richmond Police Department sat a single cardboard box marked Thompson C. 1990. The edges were worn, the tape had yellowed, but no one dared throw it out, not because they believed justice would come, but because the case felt like a wound the city wasn't ready to touch or close. Detectives passed the box for years without opening it. Some didn't recognize the name. Others remembered just enough to feel a sting of guilt before moving on to active cases that demanded their attention. Once a year, during departmental audits, the file was briefly lifted from the shelf, scanned for inventory, and placed right back where it came from. Forgotten again within minutes. But the truth doesn't dissolve just because time tries to bury it. In Caroline's file, her last trace of existence in the system meant to protect her, Waited. Waited through staff changes. Waited through reorganizations. Waited through decades of silence. It waited for someone who wouldn't shrug and move on. Someone who would pull the box off the shelf and refuse to put it back. By 2010, Detective Luis Vega was nearing retirement. And though his office desk was stacked with active cases, there was one he could never bring himself to release: Caroline Thompson. Her photo sat taped inside the corner of his drawer, the colors fading after 15 years of being opened and closed, but her eyes still sharp enough to sting him every time he looked. He'd spent years chasing leads that died too fast, talking to witnesses who remembered nothing, and begging the department for resources no one wanted to allocate to an old case. Eventually, the higher-ups stopped asking him about it. They wanted closure in the form of silence. Vega wanted closure in the form of truth. On his last week in the department, he requested to visit the evidence room. No one questioned him. He'd earned that respect. He walked straight to the dusty shelf, pulled down the Thompson box, and stood with it for a long time. The box felt lighter than he remembered. Maybe it was him who felt heavier. He reopened every item: the torn sweater, the Polaroids of the search, the typed witness statements full of contradictions, and the tiny, overlooked evidence envelope containing a hair fragment no one had known what to do with in 1995. He didn't want to leave the case behind, but retirement was non-negotiable. Still, he refused to walk away empty-handed. Vega wrote one note, just one, tucked it inside an unsealed envelope, and slid it into the file. It read, "There was someone the team didn't look at twice. Check the men who live closest, one in particular." Then he closed the box, placed it back on the shelf, and walked out of the department for the last time. That note would sit unseen for nearly a decade, until someone finally opened the box. By why Caroline's mother, Miriam Thompson, carried grief in a way that frightened even those who loved her. She wasn't loud, she wasn't dramatic, she was steady, relentless, and heartbreakingly hopeful in a world that gave her nothing to hold on to. Every year on March 4th, the anniversary of Caroline's disappearance, Miriam hosted a vigil in the small park across from the old textile mill. In the early years, the turnout was strong. Friends, neighbors, classmates, church members. They filled the benches, lit candles, and spoke Caroline's name with warmth and disbelief. But time is cruel. People move, people forget, people get tired of holding space for someone else's pain. By 2005, the crowd shrank. By 2010, only 4 people came. By 2014, it was just Miriam, standing alone with a candle that flickered like it might give up before she did. Still, she whispered her daughter's name into the air, as if speaking it might keep the last pieces of Caroline alive. She wrote letters to newspapers every year, begging them to revisit the story. Only one printed a 2-sentence blurb in the corner of page 7. She called the police department so often that new officers recognized her voice before she even said her name. They always answered her with the same tired line, "There's nothing new, ma'am, but we haven't forgotten." But she knew the truth. She was the only one who hadn't forgotten. Her mailbox stayed empty. Her phone stayed silent. Her heart stayed open in a way that should have broken her. And every night, without fail, she turned on the porch light, the same light that had burned since the night Carolyn disappeared. Her neighbors wondered why she still kept it on. Miriam never answered them, because the truth was simple. She wasn't lighting the porch for the living. She was lighting it for the girl who never came home. Miriam's porch became a landmark without ever meaning to be one. People passed by it on their evening walks, some slowing down, some pretending not to look, others whispering to their children, "That's the house with the light." Not everyone knew the story, but they all knew the glow. Steady, stubborn, untouched by storms or time. It was the only thing in the neighborhood that never changed. Some nights, Miriam would sit in the doorway with Caroline's childhood photo balanced on her lap. She'd run her thumb across the glossy surface, tracing the same smile again and again, searching for clues that weren't there. A mother's mind tries to make patterns out of pain. She wondered if she should have walked with her that evening, wondered if she should have asked more questions, wondered if there was a moment, even one, when she could have changed the ending. The truth was cruel, but she never looked away from it. Caroline had vanished into a world that kept moving without her. Birthdays passed like unfinished sentences. Holidays felt hollow, stripped of color. Miriam still wrapped a small gift every December, something Carolyn would have liked, and placed it in the top drawer of her dresser. She never opened them afterward. She couldn't. By the late 2000s, most of the city treated the case as a ghost story told during power outages. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the creek where her backpack was found. Older residents avoided the subject because remembering hurt more than forgetfulness. The world had moved on, but Miriam lived in the same year over and over. Every night when she locked the front door, she paused. She'd whisper a single sentence into the quiet. "Come home if you can." She knew her daughter would never walk through that door again. But hope doesn't follow logic. It follows love. And hers never dimmed, not even as her hair turned silver and her hands began to tremble when she lit the candle by the window. The porch light stayed on. Her voice stayed soft. Her faith stayed unbroken. Even when the rest of Richmond forgot Caroline Mason's name, her mother carried it like a heartbeat, constant, steady, and waiting. Years turned into decades, but something in the city eventually began to shift. Quietly at first, almost ashamed that it had slept for so long. A new generation of officers entered the Richmond Police Department, young enough not to know the full story, but curious enough to ask why an old case box was still sitting on the far left shelf of the archives. It carried a faded label, barely readable anymore. Mason C., 1990, bombing in Madam. Detective Alana Ruiz was the first to pull it down. She didn't know the name, didn't recognize the photo paper-clipped to the front, didn't understand why her chest tightened when she looked into the girl's eyes. Eyes caught forever in a moment life never allowed to finish. Something inside her whispered that this file wasn't done. It had just been waiting for someone who refused to let dust be the final word. She checked the digital records. Nothing updated since 2001. She scanned the witness statements, contradictions everywhere. She reviewed the evidence list. Incomplete, rushed, careless. It wasn't negligence. It was a department overwhelmed by the era. But all Ruiz saw was a story paused mid-sentence, begging to be continued. That night, she sat alone beneath the harsh glow of the archive room light, studying every item: the torn festival wristband, the hair tie found near the creek, the scrap of fabric clinging to a broken fence. None of it made sense until she saw the final entry in the chain of custody log. Biological trace collected, insufficient tech for testing. She felt a chill shoot through her ribs. Insufficient back then. Not now. For weeks, she pushed for clearance to retest the only remaining swab. Supervisors dismissed her at first. Budget limits, workload, priority cases. But Ruiz didn't back down. She printed reports, gathered precedents from other cold case breakthroughs, and argued until her voice turned hoarse. She didn't do it for credit. She barely knew the victim. She did it because the untouched evidence felt wrong, like someone had turned away from something that still had breath left in it. One late afternoon, permission finally arrived. The sample was approved for advanced genome sequencing, the kind that didn't exist when Carolyn vanished. Ruiz carried the evidence bag to the lab herself, cradling it like it was something fragile and sacred. The technician accepted it with a slow nod, understanding the weight of what he held. As he slid it into the testing chamber, Ruiz whispered under her breath, "Let her speak." Days passed, then a week, then another. Nothing. Ruiz checked her email obsessively, refreshed her phone every few minutes, slept in her office twice, and drank more stale coffee than any reasonable human should. But she refused to leave it alone. She refused to let the city fall asleep again. And then, without warning, her inbox pinged. One message, one line, one moment that shattered 27 years of silence. "Detective Ruiz, we have a hit." Her breath caught, her heart hammered, and for the first time since opening the file, she felt the ground shift beneath her. Not from fear, but from the weight of long-awaited truth rising to the surface. The story wasn't finished. It was waking up. The email wasn't detailed, just a request to come to the lab immediately. Ruiz grabbed her jacket, the case file, and her keys with shaking hands. The drive across Richmond felt longer than the 27 years the case had been asleep. Every red light felt like a personal insult. Every second felt stolen from a girl who had already had too much stolen. When she finally stepped into the lab, the technician didn't greet her with a smile. He didn't need to. His face said everything. "We got a partial," he said quietly. "Strong enough for genealogy tracing." Ruiz swallowed hard. Partial was enough. Partial meant hope. Partial meant the universe hadn't forgotten a girl the city tried to move past. They uploaded the data into the genealogical cluster, a system capable of scanning millions of public DNA profiles. The progress bar crawled forward in inch by inch, as if the machine understood the gravity of the moment. 1 minute passed, 2, 5, and then a sound that didn't belong in a room filled with decades of sorrow. A chime. The screen flashed. Match found. Second cousin range. A name appeared. Unfamiliar, ordinary, easy to overlook. But Ruiz didn't overlook anything. She pulled up the profile, traced the family tree, linked surnames, cross-referenced addresses, checked migration timelines. Each connection led her closer, tightening the circle around whoever had left a trace on Caroline's final night. Then her finger stopped. A man's name, a Richmond address, a face staring back from a 30-year-old driver's license photo. Martin Hale. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She recognized him, not personally, but from the earliest witness statements. He lived 2 streets from where Caroline was last seen. He'd been interviewed once briefly in 1995. His alibi back then? "I was home, asleep." No one had verified it. Ruiz felt a deep, burning anger rise inside her, not just at the name, not just at the photo, but at the fact that this man had lived his life, uninterrupted, while Caroline's mother had kept the porch light burning for nearly 3 decades. She pulled every record she could find, past addresses, employers, neighbors, church memberships. Nothing stood out at first. No red flags, no arrests, no domestic calls. But when she compared the original witness map to his old property line, her breath caught in her throat. His backyard connected to the path Caroline walked that night. The world seemed to tilt. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was a door that had been waiting for someone brave enough to knock. Ruiz picked up her phone, dialed her supervisor, and said 6 words that carried the weight of an entire generation's grief. "I know who took the girl." Her supervisor went silent. Then, "Move carefully. Don't alert anyone." But Ruiz wasn't thinking about caution. She was thinking about one woman, sitting alone in a house lit by a porch bulb that had never been allowed to die. She was thinking about promises made by officers long retired, promises broken by a system that stopped caring. She was thinking about a girl who deserved to come home. And for the first time in 27 years, justice started walking toward the truth. Detective Ruiz didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with the genealogy chart printed out, each branch highlighted, each name traced with a precision born from obsession. Every detail of Martin Hale's life raised more questions than answers. He lived quietly, worked quietly, moved quietly, too quietly. Men like him didn't draw attention. They blended in by being forgettable. For nearly 3 decades, he had been exactly that, forgettable. The kind of neighbor who waved from the yard, offered to help carry groceries, and shoveled the sidewalk after storms. The kind of man people praised without ever actually knowing. But the DNA was no coincidence. The proximity was no coincidence. His early interview, so brief, so easily dismissed, was no coincidence. By sunrise, Ruiz had built a timeline that made her chest tighten. Hale was 23 in 1995. He lived alone. His work schedule put him on the same route Carolyn walked that night. He even volunteered in the early search efforts, handing out coffee and bottled water to the same officers who once considered him harmless. It made her sick. She returned to the precinct before anyone else arrived. She printed the old interview transcript, just 1 page long. 10 questions, 10 answers, nothing meaningful. But at the bottom, scribbled in the margin, was a note from the original detective. "Check alibi properly." It had never been checked. Ruiz slammed the file shut and marched to her supervisor's office. He wasn't there yet. So she waited in the hallway, pacing like a trapped storm. When he finally walked in, she didn't give him a chance to sit down. "We need a covert DNA confirmation," she said. "Today." He rubbed his forehead. "We have procedures, Elena." "We've had procedures for 27 years, she snapped. "Look where that got us." Her voice echoed in the room. Her supervisor stared at her, silent. He knew she was right. Everyone who'd touched the case before her had failed that family, failed that girl, failed the truth. "Fine," he finally said. "Do it quietly." Quietly. They always said that. Ruiz stepped into the hallway, grabbed her badge, and headed straight for the surveillance unit. She requested a discreet stakeout team. She didn't give details. She didn't need to. Her tone told them everything they needed to know. By afternoon, unmarked cars were parked near Hale's modest brick house. His curtains were closed. His yard was tidy. Nothing about the home screamed danger, and that made Ruiz's stomach churn. Hours passed. Just before dusk, Hale stepped outside with a small trash bag. He walked it to the curb, tossed it into the bin, and returned inside. The bin was collected every Wednesday. Today was Tuesday. Perfect. As soon as the door closed behind him, Ruiz nodded to her team. They retrieved the bag, sealed it, and drove it straight to the lab. Ruiz followed behind them, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. Back at the lab, the technicians worked fast. They isolated a soda can, a fork, a paper napkin. All of it went into processing. Ruiz stood at the window watching the machines run. She had waited months for something like this. Caroline's mother had waited decades. The universe had taken its time. But finally it was speaking. 90 minutes later, the lab door opened. The technician looked pale. He handed her a printout. Ruiz read it once, then twice. Then her breath left her body completely. Full match, 100%. Her knees nearly buckled. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She whispered one sentence. A promise meant for a woman who kept a porch light burning for a child who never came home. "Miriam, we found him." Ruiz didn't wait for a full briefing or a formal meeting. Some news doesn't belong in a conference room. It belongs to the person who suffered the most. She drove straight to Miriam's house, her hands trembling on the steering wheel with every mile she crossed. When she pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on, glowing like a small, stubborn star against the fading evening sky. It had been on for 27 years, never once turned off. Ruiz stood at the bottom of the steps, suddenly unsure how to climb them. How do you knock on the door of someone who has carried a lifetime of hurt? How do you tell them the truth finally came home? But not the way they dreamed. Miriam opened the door before Ruiz could knock. She always seemed to know when someone was standing there. Her face was older now, thinner, softer, shaped by years of sorrow instead of time, but her eyes were the same, wide, watching, waiting. "Detective," she whispered, her voice raspy from a day of not speaking. Ruiz swallowed hard. "Miriam, may I come in?" The older woman stepped aside. Inside, the living room looked like a shrine frozen in time. Caroline's graduation photo, her favorite book on the coffee table, the same floral curtains that had hung there since the early 90s. Nothing had moved, not really. Ruiz sat down across from her. Miriam didn't offer tea, didn't smile politely, didn't try to cushion the moment with small talk. She just placed her trembling hands in her lap and stared at the detective. "You found something," Miriam said. Not a question, a truth. Ruiz nodded, her throat tight. "We did." The silence that followed felt alive. Ruiz took a breath that shook on the way out. "We identified a suspect, and we confirmed it. There's a full DNA match." Miriam didn't blink, didn't speak. She simply stared at Ruiz, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress like she needed to hold on to something solid. Ruiz continued softly. "His name is Martin Hale." Miriam's lips parted. A sound escaped her, not a cry, not a gasp, something raw, strangled, and years overdue. Her eyes filled, not with a single tear, but with an entire lifetime's worth. "I knew it," she whispered. Not because she knew him, but because she knew the world didn't lose her daughter by accident. Ruiz leaned forward. We're preparing the warrant now. Tomorrow morning we arrest him. For the first time in decades, Miriam's shoulders eased. Just slightly. Grief didn't leave her body, but something else did. The crushing weight of being the only person who still believed her daughter mattered. She didn't smile. It wasn't a smiling moment. She exhaled. A long, shaky exhale that carried 27 years of silence with it. Ruiz looked toward the porch light glowing through the window and said quietly, "You won't have to keep that in much longer." Miriam closed her eyes. That light wasn't for her to find home, she whispered. It was for the truth to find her. The next morning wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens screaming down the streets of Richmond, no helicopters, no crowds pressing against police tape. Justice didn't come crashing in. It walked. Detective Ruiz stepped out of her unmarked car just after sunrise, the air cold enough to sting her lungs. Hale's small gray house sat quietly at the end of the block, looking exactly like the kind of place no one questions, no one watches, no one fears. A place where a man could hide for nearly 3 decades. The officers moved with steady purpose. No shouting, no chaos, only the grim understanding that this moment had been owed to a girl whose life stopped in 1995. Ruiz knocked once. "Martin Hale, we have a warrant." For a second, nothing happened. Then the door opened. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. He didn't pretend to be confused. He simply lifted his hands as if he'd been expecting this moment every day since he took Caroline's future from her. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Ruiz looked him in the eyes, not seeking answers, but acknowledging the weight of what was long overdue. Hale lowered his gaze. A coward always does. Back at the station, Ruiz didn't celebrate. No one did. They worked quietly, processing paperwork, logging evidence, completing tasks that felt mechanical compared to the storm of emotion moving through the city. When Miriam received the call, she didn't speak at first. She pressed a hand to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks, but her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Thank you." Not because justice felt complete, it never does, but because the truth was finally louder than the silence. That evening, as the sun faded behind the Richmond skyline, Ruiz drove past Miriam's house. The familiar porch light, the one that had burned for nearly 30 years, still glowed in the window. But this time, something was different. The front door was open. Miriam stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring into the soft glow like she was seeing it for the first time. Ruiz stepped out of her car and approached slowly. "You can turn it off tonight," Ruiz said gently. Miriam hesitated, her fingers hovering over the switch inside the doorway. "I thought this day would feel happier," she whispered. "It isn't happiness," Ruiz said. "It's truth, and truth is enough for now." Miriam nodded, her hand trembled once, and the light went out. For the first time since 1995, the porch stood in darkness. Not the darkness of fear, but the darkness of a story finally allowed to rest. Ruiz looked up at the night sky, the stars dim behind a thin veil of clouds, and breathed out slowly. Justice hadn't brought Caroline home. Nothing could. But it had brought her mother a place to stand that wasn't shaped by doubt. And sometimes, that's the closest this world comes to mercy. The story of Caroline Brooks didn't end the night she vanished. It didn't end when the search failed. It didn't end when the case went cold. And it didn't end when the world forgot her name. It ended only when the truth refused to stay buried. Martin Hale lived as a neighbor, a coworker, a friendly face in a quiet city, a man no one questioned, a man people waved to, a man who blended into the rhythm of normal life. But behind those small, harmless habits was a crime that stole nearly 3 decades from a grieving mother. He aged, he smiled, he carried on. But justice waited, justice watched, justice remembered. And when it finally arrived, it wasn't loud, it was steady, it was earned, it was owed. Tonight, as Richmond closes a chapter it never thought would reopen, one truth remains: silence doesn't erase a crime. Time doesn't heal what was taken. And evil doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like the man holding the door open for you at the grocery store. If you've stayed with us this far, let me ask you something. How many stories like this are still buried in your own community? How many names never made the news? How many faces never made it home? Don't wait for the next case to catch you off guard. Subscribe, stay aware, stay alert, stay one step ahead. And if you still choose not to subscribe, drop a comment and tell us why. Your voice matters too. Thank you for watching Cold Case Deep Dive. Good night and stay safe.